Good morning from Jerusalem. This is Yossi Klein Halevi, and I'm delighted to be with all of you, even long distance. The good news here in Israel is that the most unwieldy and unlikely coalition in Israel's history is nevertheless holding steady. It has recently passed a budget, giving the country its first budget in over 3 years. And there's a sense of restored stability, of a sense of calm returning to what has really been an overheated and increasingly dysfunctional political system. And that's a good segue for my topic this morning, which is understanding Israel's multiple schisms and why I nevertheless believe we should be optimistic about the future of Israel. This government contains within it some of our most intractable schisms. There's no government that I can think of like this in any democracy anywhere. You have the hard right Yamina sitting together with the hard left Meretz, and thrown into this mix of right, left, and center is even more unlikely an Islamist party. The first Israeli government to truly be a coalition of Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. And I believe that this really is a model for increasingly dysfunctional democracies around the world, a model of how political opponents can come together, can transcend their differences even without resolving them, and can find a sense of commonality that really has eluded us until now. And the message of this government really is that what unites Israelis ultimately is more important than what divides us. Now, this government will not resolve our schisms. I believe that it will help heal some of the more open wounds, but we need to be modest about our expectations. And in some sense, the very existence of this government really is itself the reason for celebration. And what I'd like to do with you this morning is unpack 3 of our major fault lines, three of the main schisms that run through Israeli political discourse. The first, of course, is the future of our relationship with the Palestinian people, the future of our relationship with the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the occupied territories, the liberated territories, call it what you will, and whatever you call it will place you at a different place, of course, on the political spectrum. The second schism that has really been with us since the founding of the state and really even preceding the state in the formative years of the Zionist movement is the struggle between secular and religious interpretations of Zionism, and as it plays out in our day, tensions between religion and state. And the third schism that I'd like to address today is the fraught relationship between Israel's Jewish majority and Arab minority, between Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. And another way of framing that schism is the tensions between Israel as a Jewish state and Israel as a democratic state. So let's look at the Palestinian issue and try to unpack where we are at this moment in Israeli society in relation to the Palestinians. Now, a good place for me to begin is where I'm sitting right now. I'm in my apartment in the Jerusalem neighborhood of French Hill. I live literally in the last row of houses of French Hill, which is to say the last row of houses in Northeast Jerusalem, at the very, very edge of the city. On the opposite hill are 2 Palestinian villages. Separating us is the security barrier. Beyond the 2 Palestinian villages is a beautiful, expansive view the Judean desert. The Dead Sea is clearly visible from my porch on a clear day. At night, I see the lights of the Kingdom of Jordan, the hills of Jordan, in the not too far distance. Another way of putting that is that I live with the unbearable intimacy of Israel's geographical dilemma. From where I'm sitting right now, I can look out and see three distinct political entities. The sovereign state of Israel ends right outside my porch. In the near distance begins the Palestinian Authority, and just beyond is the Kingdom of Jordan. If there is going to be a Palestinian state, it's not going to be somewhere out there. It's going to be right here on the next hill, separated from where I'm sitting now by a few hundred meters. And so the question, the immediate question, there's nothing theoretical about this question, is what kind of state will be my neighbor on the next hill? Will it be a peaceful neighbor? Will it be a neighbor that we'll have open borders with, reasonable relations? Or will it be another Gaza? Will I be able to live a normal life here in French Hill once a Palestinian state is created? Now, I'm speaking as someone who supports a two-state solution. In principle, the practice terrifies me. And in that sense, I think I'm a fairly mainstream Israeli. My sense is that there is still a majority of Israelis who support the principle of a two-state solution, who understand that occupying, ruling over another people as a permanent condition of Israeli reality is a disaster for Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. It is untenable for us to maintain our identity in the long term as a Jewish and democratic state while forcibly ruling over another people. And so in that sense, I'm a left-wing Israeli. But my profound skepticism about the intentions of the Palestinian national movement makes me a right-wing Israeli. And so what I've done, and I think many of us in Israel have done this, is that we've internalized the left-right debate so that it's happening inside of me. It's not happening out there in Israeli society anymore. It tears me apart. There are mornings I wake up and it's a right-wing morning. Mornings when I wake up and it's a left-wing morning. And this internal debate between left and right over the future of the territories is what makes me a centrist Israeli. Now, this is something that American Jews need to begin internalizing. The real debate in Israeli society today is no longer between left versus right. That was true in Israel of the 1980s, the 1990s. But after the Second Intifada, those 4 traumatic years of suicide bombings, the Israeli left essentially collapsed. It is now a distinctly minority position on the Israeli political map. What has taken its place is my camp, the camp of the center. And the center, as I indicated earlier, is that place in the Israeli political map. I would even go so far as to say within the Israeli psyche, within the Israeli soul, that has internalized the essential insights of the left and the essential insights of the right. And so Israeli politics today is divided not between left and right, but between left and center. That is where the argument, I believe, ultimately will be resolved, between the ideological position of the right and the more pragmatic and flexible position of the center, which agrees with the right on certain key issues. Now, the result of this internalizing of the debate between left and right, the negative consequence has been a kind of stalemate in Israeli society. We are in a prolonged stalemate where we don't know how to move forward. Anything we do seems fraught with danger. And yet, when I look forward to possible scenarios, what gives me hope for an eventual resolution in whatever form of this current impasse is the collapse of the Arab siege against Israel. And I'm speaking now about the wider region. The fact that the 70-year Arab siege against what Arabs used to call the Zionist entity, refusing to even acknowledge Israel's legitimacy, calling Israel by its name, the collapse of this, the unraveling of this 70-year siege means that Israel is no longer alone in the Middle East, as we were for most of our history. That's the significance of the historic Abraham Accords of last year. Not just that Israel has more formal peace agreements with Arab countries. We've had formal agreements with Egypt and Jordan for decades, but those were not real expressions of peace. Those were more prolonged ceasefires. What we have now with several Arab countries are genuine expressions of normalization, of intimacy. And that has created a model for a possible breakthrough for Israel within the region generally. And my hope is that that can eventually help us create the regional conditions, both economically and in terms of security, for negotiating a relatively safe transition to a two-state solution. Left on our own devices, Israel and the Palestinians will never negotiate a peace agreement. We need the Arab region. We need our Arab allies. And you know, just saying that term, Israel's Arab allies, seems almost surreal. I grew up in a reality where having Arab allies was inconceivable. And now the very countries that led the Arab oil boycott of Israel after the Yom Kippur War, the Gulf states, are now among our closest allies. And so when I look at the long-term trajectory of Israel's place in the region, I have hope not only in terms of resolving our wider conflict, but also resolving the core conflict, the core historic conflict, which is between Israel and the Palestinian people. The one final irony that I'll make note of here before moving on to our next schism is that even as the Arab siege against Israel begins to weaken and even unravel, even as Israel's legitimacy becomes more accepted in the Middle East, our legitimacy is coming more and more into question in parts of the progressive West. And this is an irony that we're going to have to live with, we're going to have to contend with, and come up with better strategies than we have in how to navigate this increasingly strange moment in Israeli history. So the next schism that we'll unpack is the fraught relationship between religion and state. My definition of Israel is that we are a secular state in a holy land. That means that we are permanently caught in an insoluble conflict between the essential secular nature of Israel, and don't forget, Israel was founded by an overwhelmingly secular Zionist movement. It was founded intentionally as a secular modern state, but founded in a land regarded as sacred not only by large numbers of Jews, but by many, many people who are non-Jews around the world. And the moment when the Zionist movement rejected Herzl's plan for resettling the Jews in a supposedly safe refuge in Uganda and insisted that the only place that the Jews could establish sovereignty in is in their historic land in Zion, in the Holy Land. At that moment, the secular Zionist movement committed us as a people, as a project, to an insoluble conflict between secular and religious, between religion and state. And I say insoluble because secularism and religious identity are both inseparable parts of Israeliness. Neither side can ever fully prevail. If Israel ever becomes fully secular or fully religious, it will not be the modern state of Israel. It will not be the Israel that was envisioned by its founders. Now, is Israel a secular state? Is Israel a theocratic state? The truth is that it depends where you're standing in Israel when you ask that question. If you're asking the question in Tel Aviv, which is San Francisco on the Mediterranean, the obvious answer is Israel is a thoroughly secular state. There's no question that this is a secular state. If you're asking that question here in Jerusalem, you might be forgiven for coming to the conclusion that this is a theocratic state. And so Israel is in its essence divided necessarily between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. These are the two poles of our being, of our identity. I often think of Israel as a secular state with too many religious laws. And one useful model, think about Ireland or Italy 2 generations ago. Democratic, Western, secular democracies with lots of religious laws. Now, I don't believe that Israel will ever become fully like Italy or Ireland. Religion is too deeply embedded in Jewish identity, in Jewish national identity. But I do believe, I certainly hope, that the long-term movement of Israeli society is away from coercive religious laws and more a question of enriching Israeli culture and education and our social fabric with a voluntary expression and of religiosity and spiritual search. That's the direction where I sense Israeli society heading. We see it in Israeli music. Israeli music used to be the great carrier of the secular Hebrew identity. Today, Israeli music is increasingly the carrier of a kind of spiritual re-Judaization of Israeli culture. And that's happening in the heart of secular Israeli culture in Israeli rock music. And so there are very significant developments happening. And we as a society have really excelled at makeshift compromises on religious secular issues. Some of those compromises have worn better than others. For example, one compromise that to my mind no longer works was the strange way in which Israel gave and still grants exclusive jurisdiction over matters of personal status, over marriage, to Orthodox Judaism. But if you want to marry civilly, you would fly to Cyprus 20 minutes away, get your civil marriage, come back to the state of Israel, and you'd be legally registered. Now that compromise worked when the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews were eligible for an Orthodox marriage if they chose to. If they rejected that option, they could go to Cyprus. The problem today is that a very large percentage of Israelis are not eligible according to Orthodox law for marriage. And I'm speaking of hundreds of thousands of former Soviet emigres. What that means is that the state has effectively disenfranchised large numbers of its own citizens, is treating them effectively as second-class citizens. If your only option as an Israeli citizen is to fly to Cyprus, there's something humiliating. The state is humiliating you. And so I believe that this relationship is untenable, and I don't believe it's going to last. There will, God willing, I say this as a religious Jew, God willing, there will be civil marriage in the state of Israel. One compromise that I think is really a model for a successful way of, if not resolving our tensions, at least lessening them, is the compromise over Shabbat observance. In principle, the compromise is that in a Jewish state, we need to honor the Shabbat in our public space, but in a secular, modern state, you can't honor the Shabbat according to strict halachic guidelines. And so, for example, the one compromise that was worked out was that Israel would permit places of entertainment to be open on Shabbat, restaurants, cafes, but not places of commerce. And that would be honoring the spirit of Shabbat, but not the halachic letter of Shabbat. In recent years, this compromise has increasingly broke down. There are more and more places of commerce that are opening. And here, as a liberal Israeli Jew, I find this deeply problematic. We need to shore up the compromise in which Israel allows all of its people to express their idea of onik Shabbat, of enjoying the Shabbat in their way, without degrading the Shabbat by commerce, because there is no way to square commerce with the spirit of Shabbat. So these are some examples of how Israeli society has tried over the years in very creative, and I would even say heroic ways, to navigate these tensions, these insoluble conflicts in our identity, to honor the religious and secular components of our identity, and without giving either side a veto over the national character of how we try to live with these tensions. The good news for me about this government is that it is going a long way toward trying to upgrade these compromises that once worked, but have become increasingly dysfunctional. And I think that one of the main areas in which this government is going to contribute to helping Israel fully enter the 21st century, God willing, the next century of our national life, is by upgrading these series of compromises over religion and state. And finally, the internal schism that is the most worrying, perhaps the most insoluble, is the tension between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority. And here I'm speaking about Arab citizens of Israel. I can't think of any other country that has as complicated a dynamic between majority and minority as we do. And the reason I say that is because Israel's Arabs are simultaneously a minority, but also in some sense, a psychological majority. And by that I mean they are a minority within a Jewish majority state, an uneasy minority, in some ways fully equal citizens, in other ways not yet fully equal citizens. And at the same time, they are part of a regional majority in which we, the Jews of Israel, are the distinct minority. And for many decades, we were the besieged minority of the Middle East. Culturally, religiously, even to some extent politically, many Israeli Arabs are part of this regional majority in which we Israeli Jews have not yet found our full place. Now, do Arab Israelis want to be part of a Jewish state, a Jewish majority state? Do the Jews of Israel want our Arab citizens to be fully part of our society? These are two unresolved questions. If you look at the polls, there is a consistent majority, even a strong majority, of Arab Israelis who affirm that they want to be part of the Israeli mainstream. Even more telling, there is in recent polls that I've seen, a slight but nevertheless consistent majority of Israeli Arab citizens who say that they are proud to be Israeli. Now that's extraordinary to me, given the fact that they are not yet fully equal citizens in all areas, given the fact that we are ruling over part of their people, their families in the West Bank. We are at war with Gaza. Many of them have family there. And still they affirm, a majority, a slight 51, 52% affirm their pride in being Israeli. That gives us a foundation for beginning to have a serious conversation over the future of the place of Arab citizens in Israeli society. Now, I understand the deep skepticism and suspicion of many Israeli Jews toward our Arab citizens for a very simple reason. If you look at the Knesset members who are elected by Arab Israelis to represent them, you will find that most of them convey the opposite message of wanting to be part of the mainstream. Most Arab Knesset members are more nationalist than integrationist. Their position is more an identity of Palestinian nationalism than of an attempt to integrate their community into Israeliness. So that reinforces this understandable Israeli Jewish fear of the loyalty of Arab Israelis. As someone who has worked with the Arab Israeli community in one form or another for many years, I believe that there really is a basis for gradual integration of Arabs into Israeli society, but this will require a significant psychological and ideological shift on the part of both the Jewish majority and the Arab minority. First, on our part, on the part of the Jewish majority, we will need to begin to internalize the fact that Israeli does not equal Jewish. Zionism created, in effect, two peoples. It recreated the Jewish people. We had been scattered communities around the world, and now we are a reintegrated and functioning Jewish people. And at the same time, Zionism did something that I'm not sure the founders fully understood, certainly not the repercussions. And that second people that the founders created are the Israeli people. Now, of course, there's a great deal of overlap between the Jewish people and the Israeli people, but we are not identical. As you well know, not every Jew is an Israeli, and not every Israeli is a Jew. Now, Israel has a deep responsibility as the center point of Jewish life around the world to maintain and strengthen connections among Jews worldwide. We are the center point of the Jewish people. That is part of our historic safekeeping. That's our historic role. On the other hand, we are a secular modern state, a democracy. And we have the responsibility to incorporate our non-Jewish citizens, not only by giving them equal rights, but incorporating them into Israeli identity. And that's a very tricky process for both Jews and for Arabs. What does it mean for Arabs to be Israeli? Not just technically, but as part of your core identity. Are we, the Jewish majority, ready for that? Is the Arab minority ready for that? This government has placed that question front and center on our national agenda. And to my mind, this may be the most significant contribution that this government makes to Israeliness in the 21st century. This is, as I mentioned earlier, this is our first government in our history that has an Arab party that not only supports the government from outside, but is an integral part of the coalition from within. This is our first joint Jewish-Arab coalition. Just think back to those terrible days of May 2021 during the Gaza fighting, when Arab and Jewish mobs, Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, were roaming the streets looking for people of the other camp to lynch, literally to lynch. That was the lowest point in the history of Arab-Jewish relations in the state of Israel, probably since 1948. And yet a few weeks later, just a few short weeks later, the first Arab-Jewish coalition in Israel's history is created. That gives you some idea of the fluidity of Israeli identity and reality. This country, to my mind, is one of the most vital and transformative of any society that I know. And that's, if I have to sum up, that's what gives me hope about Israel. And here I'd like to conclude with something personal. I moved to Israel in the summer of 1982. And I'm mentioning the summer of 1982 for a very specific reason. That was the beginning of what we now call the First Lebanon War. The summer of 1982 was one of the worst moments in the history of Israel. It was the first, and thank God, the only time when we went to war. Our soldiers were fighting and dying at the front, and tens of thousands of Israelis on the home front were demonstrating against the war. We've never experienced anything like that before or since. And if you think about it, what always unites Israelis more than any other factor is an external threat. And yet here we were at war, and it was the war itself that was dividing us. And so I landed into an Israel that was tearing itself apart, that seemed incapable of the most elementary national unity. Not only were we divided over the legitimacy of the extent of the Lebanon war, and we were besieging Beirut. It was the first time that Israel had ever besieged an Arab capital. Not only were we divided over war, but our schisms were coming to the fore in violent ways. The divide between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, Jews of European origin and Jews of Middle Eastern origin, was so intense at that period that many here openly spoke of a coming ethnic Jewish civil war. At the same time, Israel was experiencing a rate of inflation that we'd never known before. It was about 300% inflation in the summer of '82. Inflation would rise to 500%. You would get your paycheck, you would run to spend it because it was already worth considerably less by the time you got to the store. And finally, Israel was a society that was no longer attracting Aliyah. When I moved here, I waited for hours at Ben Gurion Airport for a government official to show up because it was so strange that somebody was coming here and actually moving to Israel. So this was a country, if you would have frozen the frame to Israel of the summer of 1982, you could imagine that this was a country that was on its way to becoming dysfunctional. Now, fast forward to today. Every one of those seemingly existential threats that I encountered as a new immigrant in the summer of 1982 have either been resolved or considerably lessened. Now, if God forbid we need to go to war, we are as united as we've ever been. There are virtually no protests against the war when we go to war against Hamas or Hezbollah. Almost all Israeli Jews understand that we need to come together in a time of war. In terms of the Mizrahi-Ashkenazi divide, it certainly is still a part of Israeli society, and we've seen it intensify again in recent months over tensions between this government and the Likud opposition. Nevertheless, nobody speaks today seriously of an ethnic civil war. If anything, we celebrate the growing numbers of marriages between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, which we once called intermarriage. That was the Israeli version of intermarriage, and today is simply a normative part of Israeli reality. As for our dysfunctional economy, well, you all know how that worked out. Israel today is the envy of not only the developing world, but of much of the developed world. And not only have we become startup nation, but in the 1990s, we became again startup Aliyah nation. And no one worries anymore about the balance as we used to between Jews entering Israel, between Israelis emigrating. This is, in that sense, we've all learned to relax and accept the fact that in terms of the solidity of Israeli society, we have won. This is now a country that can take its demographic solidity, and I'm speaking, of course, within the pre-67 borders, we can take the demographic solidity of Israel as a Jewish state for granted. Now, it's true that we tend to replace one set of existential threats with another. We have a whole new set of existential threats that we're dealing with. But what my experience as an Israeli has taught me is to trust in the resilience, the wisdom, the innate wisdom of Israeli society. Often we will come to the edge of the abyss, but we have the capacity, as this government proves, to pull back and surprise ourselves with our own creativity and our own ability to pull together when necessary. Now, I'd like to just conclude with a word of gratitude to all of you for the extraordinary work that JNF USA does for Israel, for your love for Israel, for being part of our story, for everything that you do to nurture both the physical ecology of the state of Israel and also our social ecology. Thank you, and warm greetings from Jerusalem.